hadn't been camping in years. Life had gotten busy, responsibilities piling up, and the simple pleasures like hiking or spending a night away from the city felt like distant memories. But this time, I was alone, craving something different. A break from the noise, the endless screens, and the people. I found an old cabin for rent, way off the beaten path, deep in the woods of a national forest a few states away from home. No cell service, no neighbors for miles, just me, the woods, and that cabin. The drive was long, winding down narrow, gravel roads through towering pine and fir trees. The last mile was rough and uneven, the old pickup truck rattling as I bounced over the dirt. I wasn't sure if the cabin was still in good shape from the photos, but the owner's description said it was rustic but livable, and I wanted raw nature, not some glamping experience. I pulled up at sunset, the fading orange light barely filtering through the dense forest canopy. The cabin was small, maybe 2 rooms, built from rough-hewn logs with a steep pitched roof covered in moss and pine needles. A chimney stuck up crookedly, and I could see the metal door to a wood stove inside through the window. A porch ran along the front, with a weathered rocking chair that creaked softly in the wind. There was no electricity, no running water, just an outhouse behind the cabin and a small well nearby. The air smelled sharp and clean, tinged with pine and damp earth. The temperature had dropped quickly, and I pulled my jacket tighter as I got out of the truck. My backpack was heavy with supplies: food, water, a lantern, extra batteries, blankets, and the small first aid kit I always carried. I locked the truck and carried everything to the cabin door, trying the rusty latch. It opened with a creak. Inside was dim but cozy. The main room had a rough wooden table, a couple of chairs, a shelf with canned food and old cooking pots, and the wood stove. I dropped my pack and got a fire going quickly, stacking dry pine kindling and splitting some logs I found by the side of the cabin. The flames sputtered to life, casting flickering shadows against the walls. The warmth was immediate and welcome, making the place feel less abandoned and more like a refuge. I spent the next hour unpacking and organizing. I put the food on the shelf, filled the metal basin with water from the well, and laid out my sleeping bag near the stove. The cabin was chilly but not freezing yet. I cooked some instant noodles on a small camping stove I'd brought, ate slowly while listening to the crackle of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves outside. The forest was settling into night, and the darkness beyond the windows felt thick and endless. After eating, I lit the oil lantern and walked around the cabin's perimeter with a flashlight. The trees were close, so close I felt like they were pressing in on me. The wind whispered through the branches, carrying sounds of squirrels, maybe a fox or two. I found some more dry wood stacked near the outhouse and brought it back. Back inside, I sat by the fire, staring into the flames and feeling my heart slow down. No noise but the wind, no one else for miles. The solitude was peaceful but also a little unsettling. It made me realize how rare it was to be truly alone. My phone was dead from lack of signal and no charger, so I couldn't even distract myself with music or messages. I decided to get some sleep early. I brushed my teeth with the cold well water, set the lantern low, and crawled into my sleeping bag. The wood stove still glowed faintly, and the fire crackled softly. Outside, the night deepened and grew colder. I pulled the blanket tighter around my shoulders. Sleep came slow. The dark pressed against the windows. Every snap of a twig or rustle in the trees made me tense. My mind imagined all sorts of things: a prowler, a wild animal, the old stories I'd heard about people going missing in the woods. But I told myself to stay calm. I was prepared, I was cautious, and I was safe inside this cabin. Then, just as I was drifting off, I heard something else. It was faint at first, a scraping sound near the back of the cabin, like nails on wood or something heavy dragged over rough ground. I froze, straining to hear. The wind had dropped. The sound came again, slow and deliberate. Not random branches, not the usual wildlife. I grabbed the flashlight, my heart pounding. I eased out of the sleeping bag, careful not to make noise, and crept to the door. The cabin's single window looked out onto a narrow clearing surrounded by thick forest. I swept the beam across the darkness but saw nothing. The noise came again, but now from the other side of the cabin. I moved slowly around to the back porch, flashlight pointed, every muscle tense. The outhouse stood there, half hidden in shadow. The scraping stopped. Silence returned. I waited for several minutes, listening to my own breathing. The fire in the stove was nearly out, so I added a log and tried to calm my nerves. I thought maybe it was an animal, raccoons or a bear trying to get into the trash. But the sound didn't match any wildlife I'd heard before. I decided to stay inside and keep the door locked. I sat down next to the stove, clutching a heavy cast iron skillet I'd found in the kitchen. I'd never felt this uneasy in the wilderness before. The isolation that felt so peaceful in daylight was now suffocating. The night dragged on. I forced myself to stay awake, listening, flashlight at the ready. Every so often, I heard something. A branch snapping far off, a low grunt or groan, the wind shifting. Then, around 3 a.m., I heard footsteps on the gravel path leading up to the cabin. The steps were slow, heavy, deliberate. Someone was walking toward me. I switched off the lantern to avoid being seen through the window. The cabin was pitch black except for the faint glow of the dying fire. The footsteps stopped just outside the porch. I held my breath, gripping the skillet, waiting. Minutes passed. No more movement. Then I heard the scrape again, this time at the cabin door. Someone was trying to open it, pulling at the handle, jiggling the latch. Panic surged through me. I tried the lock. It was broken. The latch rattled under pressure. I backed away, looking for a weapon. I grabbed a thick wooden chair, ready to swing it if the door gave way. The scraping became frantic, desperate, as if whoever was outside realized the door was locked but kept trying. The sound of a heavy boot pounding on the wood sent chills down my spine. Suddenly, the glass window near the door cracked with a sharp bang. I ducked instinctively, heart racing so loud I was sure they could hear it. For the next 20 minutes, I stayed motionless, listening. The footsteps finally faded into the woods, slow, retreating steps crunching on leaves and gravel. I stayed awake until dawn, too afraid to sleep. When morning came, I lit a fire and brewed some coffee, hands shaking. I looked outside for signs of who had come near the cabin. There were footprints in the soft ground around the porch, large, heavy boots, maybe 2 sets. No other signs, no dropped items, nothing but broken branches and trampled leaves. I searched the perimeter carefully. A makeshift campsite not far away caught my eye. An abandoned fire pit, some trash, a torn piece of fabric snagged on a branch. Someone had been living rough nearby. I packed quickly. I couldn't stay another night. I locked up, loaded my gear, and started the hike back to the truck, eyes peeled for any movement. On the way out, I kept thinking about who had been at the cabin. Someone homeless? A drifter? Or something more dangerous? The thought made my stomach churn. Back at the truck, I locked the doors and sat inside, breathing hard. The isolation that had felt like freedom was now a cage. I drove away slowly, glancing in the rearview mirror. The forest swallowed the cabin from view, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching me. The experience left me with a hard lesson about being alone in the wilderness. No matter how prepared you think you are, there are always risks. The woods don't care about your plans or your comfort. People do, though, and not all of them want you to be safe. I had been looking forward to this weekend for weeks. A quiet retreat, just me and the woods. The plan was simple. Leave the city behind, drive deep into the mountains, and spend a few days alone in a small cabin I found through an online listing. The pictures made it look perfect. Rustic, but not too remote. Just far enough away from civilization to feel like I was really getting away. The drive out there was long but uneventful. I left Friday afternoon after work with a backpack full of essentials. A few days' clothes, canned food, a portable stove, a flashlight, and the usual camping gear. I also brought extra batteries, a first aid kit, and a small hunting knife. Not that I was expecting any trouble, but you never know. The GPS route took me off the main highway and onto a narrow, winding dirt road. Trees pressed in from both sides, tall pines and oaks crowding overhead. The sun was already starting to dip low when I pulled up in front of the cabin. It looked just like the photos. A modest one-story structure made of weathered wood, a stone chimney, and a small porch with a creaky wooden bench. There was no cell signal here, but that was part of the appeal. I stepped out of the car, stretched my legs, and took a long breath. The air was crisp and smelled of pine needles and damp earth. A few birds called out, and the wind whispered through the branches. It was peaceful, perfect. Inside, the cabin was small but cozy. A single main room with a wood stove in the corner, a small kitchen area with a sink, no running water, just a tap that connected to a nearby well, a table, and a couple of chairs. There was a bedroom through a doorway with a bed and a rough wool blanket. The floor creaked a little underfoot, and the windows had thick curtains to keep out the cold at night. I unpacked my things, set up the stove with some firewood I found stacked near the back porch, and started a fire. It took some effort. The wood was damp from the recent rain, but eventually the fire caught, glowing warmly in the stove's iron belly. The cabin filled with the smell of burning pine and dry wood. Dinner was simple. Canned beans heated over the stove, some crackers, and a thermos of coffee I'd made at home. I sat at the table and ate slowly, enjoying the quiet. No traffic noise, no sirens. Just the occasional crackle from the fire and the distant sound of the forest. As night fell, the temperature dropped fast. I closed the curtains, piled on an extra sweater, and settled into the bed. The fire slowly died down, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Outside, the forest was alive with sound. The rustling of leaves, the hoot of an owl, something moving in the underbrush. I felt safe, though, wrapped in the cabin's shelter. Around midnight, I woke suddenly. Something was off. At first, I couldn't tell what it was. The silence inside the cabin felt too complete. Then I heard it. A faint scraping sound, like something dragging against wood. It was coming from outside, near the back porch. My heart started pounding. I lay still for a moment, trying to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer. But the noise kept coming, slow and deliberate. A soft scratching against the wooden siding. Then a low thud, as if something heavy was dropped or kicked against the wall. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly stood up. The floorboards creaked under my feet as I moved toward the back door. The fire in the stove had almost burned out, leaving the room in near darkness. I flicked on the light and stepped outside. The night was cold and still. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds. I swept the beam of the flashlight around the clearing, searching for movement. At first, I saw nothing but shadows and trees. Then, about 15 feet from the porch, I caught a glimpse of something. A dark shape crouched low near the edge of the tree-line. It didn't move right away, but it was definitely there. I shone the light directly on it, and it ducked behind a tree. I froze, trying to think. Whoever it was, they were close enough to reach the cabin quickly. I felt a rush of fear. Not the kind of fear you get from a scary movie, but a deep, real sense that something was wrong. I shut the door quickly and locked it. I double-checked the windows, making sure all the locks were secure. I grabbed my knife from the table and sat back down, trying to calm my racing heart. The rest of the night was a restless blur. Every few minutes I thought I heard footsteps outside, or the faint scrape of something brushing against the cabin. I kept the flashlight close, the knife on my lap, and listened as best I could. When dawn finally came, I didn't feel relief. Instead, I felt exposed. The forest looked different in the daylight, harsher somehow, less inviting. I stepped outside cautiously, scanning the perimeter. Near the back porch, I found marks in the dirt, footprints. They were boot prints, large and heavy, and they circled the cabin in a wide arc. There were also scrape marks on the siding, deep enough to catch my fingernail. I took pictures with my phone, but still no signal. The nearest house was miles away, and I was alone. I packed quickly, eating a cold breakfast as I did. I didn't want to stay another night. As I loaded my gear into the car, I noticed something else. A small bundle of sticks tied with a piece of twine, left on the porch steps. It looked deliberate, like a marker or a warning. I put the bundle in my pack and got in the car. I didn't look back as I started the engine and pulled onto the dirt road. The drive back felt tense. Every shadow in the woods seemed to shift in my peripheral vision. The radio played static, then bursts of faint voices, but no clear signal. When I finally reached the highway and cell service returned, I called the local sheriff's office to report what had happened. They took down my information but said there had been no recent reports of suspicious activity near the cabin. That was a week ago. I haven't gone back since. The memory still lingers. The feeling of being watched, the sounds in the night, the boot prints circling the cabin like a predator stalking its prey. I've told myself it was probably a trespasser or a hunter who didn't expect anyone to be there, but part of me knows it was more than that. What scares me most is the realization that I was completely alone, vulnerable, and at the mercy of whoever or whatever was out there. No ghosts, no monsters, just a person or people with unknown intentions, hiding in the woods and waiting. I still have the bundle of sticks. I keep it in a box in my closet. Sometimes, late at night, I take it out and look at it. It reminds me that nature isn't always peaceful, and sometimes the real danger doesn't come from the wild. It comes from other humans. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. After months of constant noise, crowded streets, and the non-stop hum of city life, I finally decided to escape somewhere quiet, somewhere isolated enough to unplug entirely. The cabin was tucked deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town or gas station, a place where the only sounds should be the wind through the trees, the crackle of a fire, and maybe the occasional bird or animal passing through. I had imagined peaceful days of hiking and evenings spent staring into the fire, away from the world. The drive out there was longer than I expected. The roads became narrower and rougher, eventually turning to gravel, then dirt, and finally a barely visible path through thick trees. I kept the car in low gear, gripping the wheel tightly as the sun started to set and the shadows lengthened. There was no cell service. I made a mental note of that but wasn't worried. This was exactly the kind of place I wanted. No distractions. The cabin was small and old, but solid. Weathered wood, a stone chimney, and windows so grimy I could barely see inside. The door creaked as I opened it, sending a wave of stale air toward me. Inside, the cabin smelled of damp wood, old smoke, and something faintly musty, like years of closed-up space. It was dusty, but not filthy, and I could see the remnants of someone else's last visit. An empty coffee mug on the counter, a half-used candle, a bundle of firewood stacked neatly in the corner. I dropped my backpack by the door and opened the windows to let in fresh air. Outside, the sun was dipping below the trees, casting long, orange streaks of light through the forest. I found some dry kindling in the woodpile and started a fire in the stone fireplace. The flames caught quickly, crackling and popping as the cabin began to warm. Night came fast. Without streetlights or passing cars, the forest outside was an impenetrable blackness, broken only by the flickering light from the fire. I sat on the old wooden chair, wrapped in a blanket, listening to the sounds of the woods. At first, it was peaceful. The gentle rustle of leaves, distant animal calls, the occasional snap of a twig. But as the minutes passed, I realized how unfamiliar and tense the silence was. Felt like the forest was watching, waiting. I checked my supplies. Enough food and water for a few days, a flashlight with fresh batteries, a small knife in my belt, and a fully charged power bank for my phone. Even though there was no signal, I wasn't entirely alone. The cabin was off the grid, but it had been built on a well-used trail, and a ranger station was about 10 miles away. Not close enough for comfort, but close enough to give me some reassurance. I made myself a simple dinner on the small propane stove in the kitchen, heating canned beans and rice, pouring coffee from the thermos. The kitchen was cramped and old, but functional. The cabinets rattled slightly as I moved, and the floorboards creaked underfoot. It was the kind of place where you could hear every little noise, which only made the silence outside more intense. After eating, I wrote a few notes in my journal. I always liked recording my thoughts, especially in places like this. It helped me stay grounded. Then I settled by the fire with a book, but my eyes kept drifting toward the windows. The darkness outside felt alive. Not in a supernatural way, just in the way deep forests do when you're alone. The kind of darkness that makes your skin crawl. Around midnight, the wind picked up. It howled softly through the trees, and the cabin shuddered with every gust. The fire flickered and threatened to die, so I added more wood. I heard something then, a faint, slow tapping on the outside wall near the back of the cabin. At first, I thought it might be a branch blown against the wood, but the tapping was deliberate, rhythmic. 3 quick knocks, pause, 3 quick knocks again. My heart rate quickened. I grabbed the flashlight and moved cautiously toward the door. I shone the beam outside into the blackness, but there was nothing there. No sign of animals, no people, just the trees swaying in the wind. I convinced myself it was nothing but the weather or a loose branch. Still, the feeling in my gut was uneasy. I locked the door behind me and closed the windows, double-checking the deadbolt. My mind raced through worst-case scenarios, but none seemed likely. No roads nearby, no neighbors, no visible cabins within a mile or two. If someone was out there, they would have to have walked a long way through the woods in the dark. And why would anyone come knocking at a random cabin so late at night? I went back to the chair by the fire, trying to calm down. My hands shook a little. I told myself I was overthinking, that the woods just made my imagination run wild. I kept the knife on the chair beside me, just in case. I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak, every whisper of wind made me jolt awake. Morning came reluctantly, the sky a pale gray behind the dense canopy. I stepped outside to clear my head. The forest was quiet again, the wind gone, the trees still. The ground near the cabin was littered with dry leaves, broken twigs, and the footprints of small animals. I looked carefully for any signs of human presence. Nothing. No footprints, no discarded items, no broken branches that might indicate someone had been near. I spent the day hiking nearby trails, trying to keep busy and calm my nerves. The woods were beautiful in the daylight. Tall pines, moss-covered rocks, and a creek that gurgled gently as it ran over smooth stones. The fresh air was invigorating, and I felt some of the tension ease from my shoulders. Still, I noticed a few odd things. A snapped branch here, a flattened patch of grass there. Nothing that seemed like a real threat, but enough to remind me I wasn't alone. Back at the cabin that evening, I started a bigger fire and prepared a more substantial meal. The night was colder than I expected, the temperature dipping well below freezing. The cabin's single-pane windows did little to keep out the chill, and the wooden floorboards felt like ice under my socks. I layered on clothes and huddled close to the fire. As I stared into the flames, I tried to shake off the creeping dread that settled in my chest. Then, without warning, I heard it again, the slow tapping on the cabin's wall. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks. This time, it was louder and more insistent. I didn't want to look, didn't want to move, but I knew I had to. My hands were trembling when I grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. The tapping stopped. I circled the cabin, shining the light along the walls, around the corners, behind bushes. No movement, no sign of anything or anyone. Only the cold night air and the distant howl of a coyote. I didn't want to stay out there long, so I went back inside, locking the door and windows behind me again. That night, I barely slept. I lay awake, listening for any noise, gripping the knife like a lifeline. The tapping didn't return, but every sound seemed amplified. The drip of water from the leaky roof, the whistle of wind through the cracks in the walls, the groan of the old wood settling. The next morning, I woke early, still shaken but determined not to let fear ruin the trip. I packed some supplies, intending to hike toward the ranger station to check in and maybe call someone. The thought of being completely cut off made me feel vulnerable. As I stepped outside, the cold air hit my face sharply. The sun was just rising, casting long shadows through the trees. I noticed something on the ground near the back of the cabin. A small pile of stones arranged in a rough circle. I hadn't seen them before. The stones were dirty, damp, and oddly placed, like a marker or a sign. I stared at the circle, trying to make sense of it. Someone must have put it there. But why? There were no footprints or other clues nearby. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. I moved quickly toward the trail, keeping my eyes on the underbrush. The hike was long and tiring, but the sun helped lift my spirits. When I finally reached the ranger station, I found the door locked and no one around. A sign indicated the station was closed for the season. I was more isolated than ever. On the way back, I took a different path, one less traveled but shorter. The woods were quiet except for the occasional bird and the rustling of leaves beneath my boots. As I rounded a bend near a small clearing, I caught sight of something ahead. A figure crouched by the trail, dressed in dark clothing, motionless. I froze. The figure didn't move. There was no face visible, just a shadow against the trees. For a moment, my heart stopped. Then the figure stood and disappeared silently into the forest. I hurried back to the cabin, adrenaline pushing me faster. When I reached the door, I checked the locks and barred them with a sturdy wooden beam I found inside. My breath came in short gasps. The idea that someone had been watching me, lurking so close, unsettled me deeply. That night, I didn't start a fire. The wood was damp and I wanted to conserve energy. I sat in the darkness, listening for footsteps or whispers. Every snap of a twig or brush I never thought a simple weekend away would turn into something I'd never forget. I was looking for a break from everything. Work, people, the constant noise of the city. Just a quiet cabin in the woods, some fresh air, and a chance to reset. What I got was something much darker, much more real than I had expected. The plan was straightforward. Drive out of town Friday afternoon, reach the cabin by early evening, unpack, start a fire, and just enjoy the silence. The cabin was in a remote part of the Appalachian foothills, nestled deep in the forest, miles from the nearest town. It was exactly what I thought I needed. The drive itself was uneventful. The roads narrowed as I left the highway, winding between thick stands of pine and oak trees. The sky was clear, the sun dropping behind the hills, casting long shadows across the land. The only sounds were the tires humming on the asphalt and the occasional rustle of wind in the trees. As I got closer, the pavement gave way to gravel, then to dirt. The forest thickened, the trees pressing in like a living wall. When I pulled up in front of the cabin, the last light was fading fast. The cabin sat on a small clearing surrounded by towering trees. It was a modest wooden structure, maybe 500 square feet, with a simple porch and a stone chimney. The wood was dark and weathered, but the place looked solid. No power, no running water, just the basics. Exactly what I wanted. I grabbed my bags and stepped inside. The air was cool and smelled like old wood and damp earth. The inside was sparse but cozy. A small kitchen corner with a sink, the water came from a well, a wood stove in the main room, a table and 2 chairs, and a small bed pushed against the far wall. A lantern hung by the door, and there was a stack of firewood neatly piled near the stove. I dropped my bags, unpacked some essentials, and set about getting a fire going. The wood was dry, stacked in a neat pile on the porch and a larger stack inside the cabin. The fire took quickly, and soon a warm glow filled the room. The crackling of the fire was comforting, a steady, natural noise that felt like a shield against the darkness outside. I ate a quick dinner, canned beans heated on the stove and a crust of bread, then settled down on the bed with a book. The quiet was deep, almost total, interrupted only by the occasional snap of the fire and the distant call of a night bird or the rustle of leaves. It was around 10 p.m. when I first noticed something wasn't right. The cabin door was locked. I was sure of it, but every now and then, I thought I heard a faint creak, like the door moving just a little bit. At first, I told myself it was the wind or the old wood settling. The forest was alive with sounds at night, twigs snapping underfoot, animals scurrying, branches brushing together. But this was different. It was too deliberate, too steady, almost like someone was testing the lock or pushing against the door from outside. I got up and checked. The door was locked tight, no sign of anything or anyone outside. The window shutters were closed. I looked around the cabin carefully. No footprints on the porch or in the dirt nearby. The ground was dry but soft enough to hold prints if anyone had been there recently. Nothing. Still, the sound came again. A slow creak followed by a faint thud. I went to the window and peered out. The moon was out, shining through the trees and casting silvery light on the forest floor. The shadows moved, but only because of the wind. No one was there. I told myself it was just nerves. I was alone out here, miles from any help. It was easy to imagine things, but the feeling lingered. Something was off. I went back to bed and tried to read, but my eyes kept flicking to the door and windows. Then I heard it again, footsteps. Light, careful footsteps on the gravel outside. Not far, maybe 20 feet from the cabin. They circled slowly, like someone was pacing. The sound was muffled, but clear enough to make my blood run cold. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, shining the beam into the woods. Nothing. No shapes, no movement. The forest looked empty still. The only sound was the distant howl of a coyote. I sat back down on the porch, heart pounding. The cold night air made the hairs on my arms stand up. I tried to convince myself it was just some animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but it didn't feel right. The steps were too slow, too human. I locked the door again, checked the windows, and sat inside near the fire, the flashlight resting on the table. Hours passed, each minute stretching longer than the last. The sounds outside faded, but I couldn't relax. Morning finally came, pale and gray. I stepped outside to look around. The ground was dry, no footprints visible near the cabin. I walked a little deeper into the woods, looking for any sign of whoever might have been near during the night. Nothing but the usual forest debris, leaves, pine needles, broken twigs. I stayed in the cabin most of the day, gathering more firewood, cooking a little, reading, trying to shake off the unease. The sun filtering through the trees made the place seem peaceful again. The noises of the forest during the day were normal. Birds, squirrels, the wind through the leaves. But as evening came again, the shadows deepened, and the sense of being watched returned. That night was worse. Around 9 p.m., I heard it again, footsteps outside. This time they were closer, not pacing, but slow and deliberate, moving around the cabin. Then a soft thud on the roof. A single heavy knock. I froze. No one should be up here. No one should be near this place. I grabbed the flashlight and a heavy branch from the firewood pile. The beam cut through the darkness, but the trees swallowed the light. No shapes, no movement. The only sound was the beating of my own heart. Then, from the woods behind the cabin, I heard another noise, something scraping, like nails or claws against bark. I swung the flashlight in that direction but saw only the black outlines of trees. I backed into the cabin, locked the door, and sat close to the fire, gripping the branch tightly. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I decided to hike out and check the road. Maybe I could leave early, cut the trip short. I packed some water and food and walked the narrow trail back toward the main road. The forest felt different in the daylight. The canopy let in beams of sunlight that danced on the forest floor. Birds called overhead, and the smell of pine and damp earth filled my nostrils. I tried to focus on that, the beauty of the woods, but the memory of last night's noises stayed with me. When I reached the dirt road, I stopped and looked back the way I'd come. The trees closed in, a dense green wall. No signs of movement. I thought I was safe. But then, at the edge of the clearing near the cabin, I noticed something strange. The ground was disturbed. Flattened grass, some broken branches, and footprints. Large, booted footprints. They were fresh, maybe hours old. They circled the clearing, stopping at the back of the cabin and then moving off into the woods. That's when I realized I wasn't alone out there. Someone had been watching me all along. I hurried back to the cabin, heart racing. The sun was still high, but the shadows seemed longer now, more menacing. I locked the door, boarded up the windows with some old wooden planks I found in the shed nearby, and tried to think. I didn't have a phone signal. No cell service out here at all. No way to call for help. If someone wanted to get inside, I was trapped. That night was the worst. I sat up all night listening. The footsteps came again, slow and deliberate. Around midnight, I heard the sound of a rock hitting the window, a dull thud followed by silence. I didn't dare look outside. At dawn, the footsteps stopped. I waited all day, staying inside, barely eating, barely moving. When night came, there was no sound. I slept a few hours, waking up tired but relieved. The next morning, I packed my bags quickly, took the trail back to the road, and didn't look back. It was only when I was safely back in town, sitting in a crowded coffee shop with my phone working again, that I told myself I was lucky. I had no idea who had been outside my cabin that weekend or what they wanted, but I knew I didn't want to find out. Sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters. They're real people, real threats. The wilderness is beautiful but also unforgiving. Being alone out there means trusting your instincts and being prepared. But no amount of preparation stops the fear when you realize you're being watched by someone with unknown intentions. I never went back to that cabin. I packed up all my gear and found a cabin closer to town after that. One with neighbors nearby and at least a faint phone signal. Because some silence is dangerous, and some quiet isn't peace at all. I never thought I'd be the kind of person who would be caught off guard by something like this. I've always been the type to plan every detail, pack every tool, and expect the worst. But something about that weekend at the cabin broke all my usual caution. And by the end, I realized how fragile we really are when we're alone in the wilderness. I've always liked cabins. Growing up, my family had a small one up in the mountains where we would go in the summer. It wasn't fancy or modern, just a small wooden structure nestled between pine trees with a creek nearby. When I finally had a chance to escape the city, I wanted to get back to that kind of place. Somewhere quiet, somewhere that forced you to unplug from everything. My plan was simple. I'd take 3 days off work, drive to a remote cabin I'd rented, hike around, read some books, maybe fish a little, and come back feeling refreshed. I arrived late afternoon on a Friday, just as the sun was starting to dip behind the hills. The drive was long, and the last 20 miles were on a rough dirt road that bounced the car up and down. I kept thinking I'd see someone else, some other campers or weekend travelers, but the road was empty except for a few deer crossing at odd moments. I rolled down the windows for the fresh mountain air, and even though the sun was setting, the air had a crispness I hadn't felt in months. The cabin sat at the end of a small clearing, surrounded by thick woods. It looked like it had been built decades ago. Simple logs, a small porch, and a stone chimney. It wasn't fancy, but it was sturdy and clean enough. I grabbed my backpack and gear, locked the car, and made my way inside. Inside was basic but comfortable. There was a small kitchen with a wood stove, a table with a couple of chairs, and a bed in the corner covered by a thick quilt. A bookshelf held a handful of old paperbacks, mostly mystery novels and nature guides. I unpacked slowly, making sure to get my sleeping bag and supplies ready. The only thing missing was electricity, but that was part of the plan. I brought a couple of lanterns and extra batteries, so I was covered. After a quick bite of canned beans and crackers, I built a fire in the wood stove. The warmth filled the small cabin, pushing out the chill from outside. I sat by the window, watching the last light fade from the sky. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. That first night, I slept well. The silence was so complete. I could hear the subtle creaks of the cabin settling and the faint rustling of leaves outside. There was no cell signal, but I wasn't worried. I had told a few friends where I was going and when I'd be back, so I felt safe enough. The next day, I woke up early and went for a hike. There was a trailhead just a few hundred feet from the cabin, winding through thick forest and eventually leading to a small lake I'd read about in the rental description. The woods were dense, full of tall pines and moss-covered rocks. Birds sang intermittently, and the ground was soft beneath my boots from last week's rain. I moved slowly, taking in the smells and sounds of the forest. The lake was even more beautiful than I expected. A quiet, glassy surface reflecting the overcast sky, surrounded by tall trees leaning close as if to shelter it. I sat on a fallen log for a long while, eating a granola bar and sipping water from my bottle. The air was cool, almost cold, even though it was early October. I felt a calm settle over me. Back at the cabin, I prepared some stew and started another fire. The day passed quietly. As evening came, I noticed something odd. A faint smell, almost like burning rubber or something chemical. It wasn't strong, but it was definitely there. I looked around the clearing but saw no smoke or anything unusual. I shrugged it off, assuming it must be from the nearby road or some distant campfire. That night was colder than the first. The temperature dropped sharply, and the wind picked up, rattling the cabin's shutters. I bundled up in my sleeping bag and kept the fire going, but the cold crept in through the cracks around the door and windows. Still, I slept, though less deeply. On the third day, I woke up to a strange noise outside. It was subtle, like a faint scraping or dragging sound coming from somewhere in the woods around the cabin. I sat still, listening. The sound came again, slow, irregular, like something heavy being pulled across the ground. I didn't move. The forest was silent again. I decided to stay inside most of the day, reading from one of the books on the shelf. It was a true crime story about a missing hiker, which seemed fitting now. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air felt heavier, thicker somehow. Late afternoon, I went outside to check the perimeter. The ground was soft from rain, and I noticed some marks in the dirt near the back of the cabin. They looked like tire tracks, but oddly shallow and half-smudged, as if someone had driven a small ATV or dirt bike but not recently. The tracks led toward the woods and disappeared. I followed them cautiously. The woods were denser back there, and the underbrush scratched at my pants. After a few minutes, I found an old dirt path that looked like it hadn't been used much in years. But I heard the scraping noise again, this time closer. I froze and scanned the tree line. Then I saw it. A figure. Not a person, at least not fully. It was hunched over, moving awkwardly through the trees, dragging something heavy behind it. The figure wore a dark jacket, and I could see the outline of a rifle slung across its back. Its face was obscured by a hood, and it moved slowly, carefully, almost like it didn't want to be seen. I ducked behind a tree and held my breath. The figure stopped nearby and looked around, then disappeared deeper into the woods, dragging the heavy object behind. My heart was pounding. I backed away slowly, careful not to make noise. I didn't know what to do. I thought about running back to the cabin, but I didn't want to lead this person to where I was staying. When I got back to the cabin, I locked the doors and windows and pushed a heavy chair against the front door. I checked my phone again, still no signal. My mind raced. What was that person doing out here? Why were they dragging something heavy? The whole area was supposed to be quiet, deserted except for me. That night was the worst. I stayed awake nearly all night, staring into the dark woods through the small windows, listening for any sound. The scraping noise came and went, sometimes close, sometimes far. I could hear footsteps and faint voices, muffled and low. I kept my knife nearby and a flashlight loaded. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow moving across the clearing, just beyond the edge of the firelight I'd managed to keep alive in the stove. I didn't dare open the door or shout. I just sat frozen, gripping my knife. Morning came slowly. The sun's first rays lit up the forest, and I finally felt some relief. I knew I couldn't stay inside forever, but I was scared to leave, scared of what was lurking outside. After some thought, I decided to pack up and leave right away. I threw my gear into my backpack, doused the fire, and slipped on my boots. I stepped outside carefully, scanning the area. The tire tracks from before were clearer now, and more fresh ones had appeared, circling the cabin like a slow spiral. There were also footprints, heavy boots that came right up to the cabin walls. I could see dirt and mud smeared against the logs, as if someone had leaned or pressed against them. I took a deep breath and started walking down the dirt road toward my car, which I'd parked a little distance away. Every crunch of leaves or twig made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that figure again. About halfway to the car, I found something chilling. Scattered along the road were bits of torn fabric and broken branches. Then I saw it, a bloodied piece of clothing like a sleeve or a torn jacket corner. My stomach dropped. What had happened here? Was the person I'd seen hurt, or had they hurt someone else? I didn't want to stop or investigate. I walked faster, practically running, and reached my car. The door was unlocked, which was odd because I was sure I'd locked it. I slipped inside, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I pulled onto the dirt road, I noticed something I hadn't before. At the edge of the clearing near the cabin, there was a freshly dug hole, about 2 feet wide and 3 feet deep. The soil around it was loose and disturbed. I could only imagine what had been buried there. My hands trembled on the steering wheel as I drove. I didn't stop until I reached the main highway, where cell signal finally returned. I called the local sheriff's office and reported what I'd seen: the tracks, the hole, the strange figure. The officers said they would send someone to check it out, but I knew I wouldn't go back there. I packed up my things that night and booked a hotel in the nearest town. Over the next few days, news reports trickled in about an illegal poacher or a drug smuggling operation being busted in the forest nearby. The police had found evidence of someone burying stolen goods and weapons. They also found human remains that were believed to be a missing person from the area. The reports never mentioned a cabin, but I had no doubt they were connected. Looking back, I realize how isolated and vulnerable I was out there. The wilderness may seem peaceful, but when people like that are around, it can become dangerous in ways you don't expect. I've been camping and I'd been looking forward to this trip for months. A quiet weekend away, just me and the cabin deep in the woods. No phone signal, no internet, no distractions. Just the forest, the cold air, and a small wooden cabin I'd rented to myself. It was the perfect place to escape from the city noise and the never-ending buzz of everyday life. The cabin was about a 2-hour drive from the nearest town, tucked into the middle of a national forest. It was an old structure, built decades ago, but well maintained by the owner. The wooden walls were rough but solid. The windows had thick panes, and the chimney promised warmth for the cold nights ahead. The dirt road leading to it was narrow and winding, bordered by dense pine trees that blocked the sunlight the farther you went. By the time I pulled up, the sun was already dipping low, throwing long shadows across the forest floor. Unpacking was quick. I carried my backpack inside, setting down my supplies: firewood, canned food, a basic first aid kit, and a flashlight with fresh batteries. The cabin was small but cozy. A single main room with a wood stove, a small kitchen area, and a narrow staircase leading to a loft where the bed was. The air smelled like aged wood and something faintly earthy, maybe pine sap or old leaves. I liked that smell. It meant I was far away from the city. Outside, the wind rustled through the branches, and the forest was settling down for the night. I built a fire in the stove, stacking the dry logs carefully, and after a few tries, it caught. The flames threw a warm glow around the room, and I felt myself relax a little. I ate some of the canned food cold, nothing fancy, but enough to settle my stomach, and then pulled out a book I'd brought along. The soft crackling of the fire mixed with the occasional creak of the cabin settling made a quiet background. It wasn't long before the cold started creeping in. Even with the fire, the air outside was dropping quickly as the sun disappeared. I wrapped myself in a thick blanket and climbed up into the loft to lie down. The bed was firm and a little stiff, but better than I expected. I closed my eyes and let the quiet wrap around me, but sleep didn't come easily. Every little noise seemed louder in the stillness. The wind shifted suddenly outside, sending a low howl through the trees. The branches scraped against the window panes, tapping like fingers. At one point, I thought I heard a twig snap somewhere close, but the forest was full of sounds like that. I told myself it was nothing, just the wildlife moving around, maybe a deer or a raccoon. Still, my mind wouldn't let go. I kept thinking about how isolated I was out here. No cell service meant I was completely cut off. If anything happened, I was on my own. The thoughts stuck with me as I tried to settle, the silence weighing heavy like a blanket I couldn't throw off. Around midnight, I woke again. The fire had died down to glowing embers, so I slipped quietly out of bed and went to the stove to add more wood. As I opened the door, the cold air rushed in, biting at my skin. I glanced out the window. The moon was low, a thin sliver barely lighting the dark forest. Then I saw it, a pair of eyes, just beyond the tree line. reflecting a pale yellow glow back at me. They didn't blink or move, just stared. I froze, heart pounding, trying to convince myself it was an animal, maybe a deer caught in the firelight. But the eyes were too steady, too fixed. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it toward where the eyes had been, but the beam only landed on empty trees. The eyes were gone. My heart raced as I backed away from the window, telling myself it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The rest of the night passed in uneasy silence. Every shadow in the cabin felt bigger than it was, every sound sharper. I kept the fire burning, feeding it little bits of wood to keep the room warm and the darkness at bay. Morning came with a thin mist hanging low over the forest. I stepped outside, the cold air crisp in my lungs. The world was quiet except for birds starting their day and the soft rustling of leaves. I wandered around the cabin, checking for any signs of whatever had been out there the night before, but found nothing unusual. No footprints, no broken branches, no disturbance. I told myself I was just tired, and maybe my imagination had run wild in the darkness. The next few hours I spent exploring the nearby trails. The forest was beautiful. Tall trees, moss-covered rocks, and fallen leaves crunching under my boots. I walked a few miles, keeping an eye out for wildlife, but saw only squirrels and birds. The peace was comforting, but still, the unease from the night before lingered just under the surface. Back at the cabin that afternoon, I fixed a small lunch and read some more. The sun made the cabin warm, and I could hear the distant sound of a stream trickling nearby. I figured I'd find it if I followed a narrow path behind the cabin later. As evening approached, the temperature dropped again. I started a fire early this time, piling on wood until the flames roared bright. I sat close to the stove, enjoying the warmth, trying to keep my mind busy. It was hard to relax, though. I kept glancing at the windows, expecting to see those eyes again. Hours passed, and I decided to check the perimeter of the cabin before heading to bed. Taking a flashlight, I walked carefully around the building, the beam cutting through the dark. The forest felt different at night, heavier, more closed in. The shadows grew long and sharp, and every sound was louder. As I rounded the back of the cabin, something caught my eye near a tree line. A figure, not an animal, a person. I froze. The figure was hunched, wearing dark clothes that blended into the night. They weren't moving much, just standing still, looking toward the cabin. My heart jumped. I thought about the stories I'd heard, about people who camped alone, only to find others lurking nearby, sometimes with bad intentions. Out here, far from help, the risk was real. I didn't have a phone signal, no way to call for help. My only protection was a small hunting knife in my backpack. The figure didn't move when I stepped closer, shining my light directly at them. Instead, they turned and vanished into the trees without a sound. I hurried back inside, locked the door, and checked every window. Nothing broken, no sign anyone had tried to get in. But my skin felt tight, my hands trembling slightly. I sat by the fire, trying to calm down, reminding myself that maybe it was just a hunter or someone passing through. Still, the thought that someone had been watching me all day and was possibly nearby right now made the cabin feel smaller, less safe. That night was worse than the last. I barely slept, listening to every sound outside. The wind seemed louder. The trees creaked like they were whispering secrets. At one point, I heard footsteps circling the cabin. Slow, deliberate, not fast like an animal running, but careful, measured. I stayed as quiet as I could, holding the knife close. The footsteps faded away after a while, but I didn't dare look outside until dawn. Morning was a relief. The sun broke through the trees, the forest alive again with birdsong. I packed a bag quickly and left the cabin, taking the main dirt road back to my car. I didn't look back. It was only when I was safely on the highway, driving away, that I realized what might have happened. That figure I'd seen, they had been watching me the whole time. Not out of curiosity, not lost or harmless. They were waiting. Maybe they'd been following the cabin's owner, or maybe they had been hiding in the woods for days. In that remote place, the forest could be dangerous. Not because of monsters or ghosts, but because of people. People who didn't want to be found, who used the isolation to hide bad things. I didn't stop or look back until I reached the town, where cell service came back and I could call for help if I needed. I told the cabin owner about what happened, and they said they'd check the place soon, maybe with a ranger. What stuck with me wasn't just the fear of being watched or the footsteps outside. It was the realization that no matter how beautiful and peaceful a place looks, out there in the wild, you're never truly alone. And sometimes, the scariest thing isn't the dark or the wild animals. It's the people you don't see coming. It was late October when I decided to take a break from everything and spend a few days alone in the woods. I'd been working nonstop for months, caught in a cycle of emails, meetings, and endless city noise. The idea of a cabin far from any road, surrounded by trees and silence, sounded like exactly what I needed to clear my head and recharge. I didn't want any distractions, no phone, no internet, no people. Just me, a book, and the forest. I found a small cabin listed online that seemed perfect. It was about a 3-hour drive from the city, tucked deep in a national forest in a remote area with only a rough dirt road leading to it. The pictures showed a modest wooden cabin, weathered by time but sturdy enough, with a stone chimney and a small porch. The owner said it wasn't often rented, so I'd probably be alone the whole time. That suited me fine. The day I left, the sky was clear, with a pale sun filtering through a thin layer of clouds. The air had that crispness that only early fall has, the kind that hints at winter coming soon. I packed the car carefully, making sure to bring enough food, water, a decent first aid kit, and plenty of firewood. I also grabbed a heavy flashlight and a hunting knife, more because I felt I should than because I expected to need them. The drive to the cabin was long but peaceful. The highway gave way to smaller roads and eventually to that rough dirt path. The car rattled as I bumped over roots and stones. The trees on either side grew taller, thicker, their branches tangled and dark against the dimming sky. By the time I turned the last corner, the cabin came into view, sitting quietly in a small clearing. It looked just like the pictures. Quiet, alone, surrounded by forest. I pulled in and parked near the porch. The first thing I noticed was how still everything was. No birds, no insects buzzing, no distant hum of cars or people. Just silence except for the faint creak of the wind moving through the branches. It was a heavy silence, not peaceful but thick, like the forest was holding its breath. I stepped out of the car, stretched, and unloaded my gear. The cabin smelled of old wood and smoke, probably from the last renters who'd used the fireplace. I spent the next hour unpacking, stacking firewood near the door, and gathering some dry kindling outside. The cabin was simple inside. There was a small living room with a wood stove, a tiny kitchen, a bedroom with a cot, and a small bathroom with cold running water from a well nearby. I started a fire in the stove, careful to get it going before the sun fully set. The warmth felt good after the chill outside. I ate some canned soup, read for a while by the fire, then settled in early. The silence outside was complete now. I could hear the occasional snap of a twig or the rustle of leaves, but no animals, no voices, just the forest breathing around me. I slept fitfully the first night. The cabin creaked as the wind pushed against the walls, and strange shadows moved in the corners of the room. I kept hearing soft sounds outside, branches tapping on the windows, a faint rustle in the underbrush. Every time I opened my eyes, I saw nothing but darkness. I told myself it was just the forest, the wind, my imagination playing tricks. The next morning, I woke to gray light filtering through the small windows. The temperature had dropped overnight, icy cold that made the windows frost at the edges. I dressed quickly, building the fire up again to warm the cabin. Outside, the ground was damp with overnight dew, and the trees looked darker, the forest denser. I decided to hike the trail I'd seen on the map. It started just behind the cabin and wound deeper into the woods. I grabbed my pack with water and snacks and took the old trail, careful with each step over roots and stones. The forest was quiet, almost too quiet. Usually, I would hear birds or squirrels or the chatter of small animals, but here it was just dead silence. No life, just trees and shadows. As I walked, I noticed signs that the area was rarely visited. The trail was overgrown in places, fallen leaves covering parts of it. At one point, I saw an old rusted metal trap half buried in the dirt. That made me pause. I'd never seen traps on public trails before. The thought of someone setting traps nearby unsettled me. I left the trap alone but kept it in mind as I continued. After a couple of miles, the trail led to a small creek. The water was clear but cold, rushing quietly between moss-covered rocks. I filled my water bottle and sat on a fallen log to rest. The forest here felt thicker, darker. The trees leaned in close, their branches intertwined overhead, blocking much of the gray sky. Felt like the forest was closing around me, watching. I didn't stay long and turned back to the cabin. As I walked, I noticed small things that didn't feel right. Broken branches snapped in places where no animals had been. Patches of ground flattened as if something had lain there recently. The silence remained absolute, but the forest seemed more alive somehow. Tense, as if something unseen was moving just out of sight. Back at the cabin, I tried to shake off the feeling. I built a fire, made a simple dinner, and settled in with my book again. Night came quickly, and the cold crept back into the cabin. I wrapped myself in a blanket by the stove, but sleep was hard to find. Outside, I thought I heard faint footsteps crunching leaves, slow and deliberate. I got up several times to check the windows. Nothing. On the third day, I woke early, the fire long dead and the cabin cold. The wind was stronger now, rattling the windows and making the trees groan. I checked my supplies and decided to spend the day cleaning and organizing, trying to keep my mind busy. The forest outside looked wild and unwelcoming under the gray sky. Later, I noticed the batteries in my flashlight were dying faster than they should. I found an extra pack, but that made me uneasy. I had been careful not to waste the batteries, yet somehow they were draining quickly. The idea of being left in the dark out here made my skin crawl. That night, the sounds outside were worse. There were heavy footsteps circling the cabin, slow but steady, as if someone was pacing just out of sight. The shadows seemed to move in unnatural ways, and the wind brought strange noises, low grunts, something like breathing, too heavy and uneven to be the wind. I stayed by the fire, clutching the knife, heart pounding. The next morning, I found something I hadn't expected. My car was missing. I stood on the porch, stunned. The place where I'd parked was empty. The dirt was disturbed, tire tracks leading away into the trees, but no sign of my car anywhere. Couldn't believe it. I searched the area as best as I could, walking along the rough road, but the tracks just disappeared into the woods. Whoever took my car had driven it deep into the forest and abandoned it or hidden it. Panic rose in my chest. I had no way to leave now, no cell service, no way to call for help. I was completely isolated. I went back into the cabin and locked the doors. I checked every window and made sure they were shut tight. I piled more wood on the fire, trying to stay warm and calm. I rationed my food and water carefully, knowing I might be here longer than planned. That day, I spent hours watching the trees outside, eyes scanning the shadows. I was convinced someone was watching me, maybe even waiting for me to make a mistake. I thought about walking out on foot, following the road to find help, but the woods were dense and I had no idea how far it was to civilization. It was October, and nights were already cold. I wasn't prepared to survive on my own in the forest without supplies. Night came again, and with it the noises. This time, the footsteps were joined by something else. Soft tapping on the windows, slow and rhythmic, like someone trying to get my attention. I didn't move, didn't respond. The fire burned low, the cabin growing colder. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow moving just beyond the tree line. It vanished when I looked closer. I didn't want to believe someone was out there, watching and waiting. On the fourth day, I started hearing voices. It wasn't loud, more like murmurs carried on the wind. I wasn't sure if it was real or just my imagination twisting the sounds of the forest. I stayed inside, not wanting to risk seeing who or what might be nearby. The cold was unbearable. The cabin had no heating besides the wood stove, and I was running low on firewood. I wrapped myself in all the clothes I had and tried to stay still, conserving energy. Late in the afternoon, I heard a crash from the woods. Something large breaking branches, moving fast. My heart stopped. I grabbed the knife, ready to defend myself if needed. But no one came to the cabin. The sounds moved away quickly, disappearing into the thick trees. That night was the worst. The footsteps were all around now, circling the cabin like predators stalking prey. The tapping on the windows turned into pounding, hard and relentless. I pulled the curtains closed and wedged a chair against the door. I stayed awake all night, listening to every sound. It was the kind of quiet that feels like it could swallow you whole. The remote summer cabin where my family stayed was perched on a steep hill in the dense forests of northern Sweden. I was 15 at the time, and it was one of those places where the outside world, noise, light, everything, felt miles away. The cabin itself was small and wooden, with simple windows that looked out onto nothing but thick trees, the slope of the hill, and down at the bottom, a small lake. The lake was calm and dark, its surface just reflecting the few stars that peeked out behind the clouds that night. There was a narrow wooden bridge crossing a little inlet, and two small boats tied up along the shore, swaying gently in the stillness. My cousins and I were with our dads, walking down the hill toward the lake just after 9 in the evening. The rest of the family, our grandparents, aunt, and mom, had stayed back in the cabin because it was starting to get chilly, and the night was falling fast. The temperature was dropping too, crisp and sharp in the air, as it often did in the fall. We carried some firewood and matches, and the two dogs, one belonging to my grandparents and the other to my cousins, followed closely behind, their paws soft against the mossy ground. The hill was steep, covered in a thick carpet of pine needles and moss, with the occasional fallen branch snapping underfoot. The trees towered over us, casting long shadows, and their dense branches blocked out most of the remaining daylight. As we got closer to the lake, the smell of damp earth and pine grew stronger. It was one of those smells that felt both comforting and wild at the same time, like the forest was breathing around us. Once at the lake, we built the fire in a small fire pit right near the water's edge. The wood caught quickly, crackling and popping as the flames grew, casting flickering orange light across our faces. We sat down on some fallen logs arranged around the fire, the heat warm against the cooling air. The dogs curled up near the fire, their bodies relaxing but their ears twitching now and then as they listened to the quiet noises of the night. For a while, we just sat there. The conversation started easy, talking about school, the coming winter, plans for next summer. But as the fire burned down to glowing embers, the words slowed and finally stopped. The kind of silence that fell wasn't uncomfortable. It was peaceful, a quiet that made you listen closely to everything. The distant call of a bird settling in for the night, the gentle lap of water against the shore, the soft rustling of leaves far off in the dark woods behind us. But then, even in that peaceful silence, I started to feel something strange. It was a sensation I hadn't experienced before but instantly recognized. The feeling of being watched. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe it was just my imagination or the way the shadows moved in the firelight. But the feeling stayed, growing heavier, like something unseen was just beyond the edge of the firelight, hiding in the trees behind us. We were all sitting with our backs to the woods, facing the lake, the cabin behind us up the hill out of sight. The woods behind felt thick and impenetrable, the trees so close together they blocked out the stars and the moon. It felt like those trees were holding something, watching us, waiting. Suddenly, out of nowhere, my dad said, "Yes, I'm good." His voice was calm, but everyone turned to look at him in confusion because no one had asked him anything. He glanced toward the cabin, then at my cousin sitting beside him. "Yeah, I'm doing good." My cousin frowned and said, "What? I didn't ask you anything." Dad looked puzzled and then explained something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. He said he felt someone lean over and whisper in his ear. The words were clear in his mind. "Hello, how are you?" And he described feeling warm breath on his neck and a hand on his shoulder. At first, he thought it was my mom, who was supposed to be back at the cabin, so he turned around quickly, but there was no one there. The dogs suddenly snapped to attention, their growls deep and low, coming from somewhere just behind my dad, toward the dark woods. They were staring straight into the trees, hackles raised and teeth bared. It was the kind of growl that told you they saw or smelled something no one else could. We all froze, the firelight flickering wildly in the sudden breeze. The silence of the woods felt like it was closing in on us, heavier now, thicker. We could hear something, maybe a branch breaking or leaves shifting, just beyond the fire's glow. No one spoke. We didn't move. After a few long seconds, the dogs barked sharply, and we grabbed the remaining embers of the fire and stomped them out fast. The warmth vanished, and the darkness seemed to close over us like a blanket. We ran, fast, stumbling up the hill toward the cabin, hearts pounding so hard it felt like they'd burst. The dogs stayed close, barking and snarling as they ran. Back inside the cabin, with the door locked tight behind us, everything felt different. The windows showed nothing but blackness, the forest swallowed by night. The dogs paced, restless, while we stood silent, each one of us trying to process what had happened. For the rest of the trip, we didn't go outside after dark. We stayed close to the fire inside, the cold air pressing against the windows. Sometimes, when the wind blew just right, I thought I could hear the faintest sound from the woods, like someone breathing, watching, waiting. That night and the feeling it gave me stuck with me for years. What it was, I can't say for sure. There was no shadowy figure, no strange lights, no footprints, just a voice that wasn't there, a touch that shouldn't have been, and dogs that saw something real beyond our eyes. When I look back, I think it was something natural, something from the woods itself, a wild animal maybe, or something human that wanted to watch but not be seen. The feeling of being watched wasn't from fear or danger alone. It was curiosity, too. Whatever it was didn't want to hurt us that night. It just wanted to be noticed. The cabin sits there still, on that hill, surrounded by trees that hold their secrets tight. I haven't gone back to sit by the lake after dark since. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still feel the heat of the fire, the cool air on my skin, and that quiet, watchful presence just beyond the trees. The first thing I should say is this is all real. Every bit of it. I'm not making any of this up, even if it sounds crazy. I'm telling it exactly how it happened because the truth matters, and because if anyone else ever ends up in the same situation, maybe this can help them. Or at least warn them. I'm a guy who likes the outdoors. I'm not some expert woodsman or survivalist, but I know how to camp, hike, and enjoy being away from the city. That's why I agreed to go on this trip to a remote cabin in Colorado with my fiancée and a couple of friends. The cabin belonged to a friend of mine who disappeared a year before, and part of the reason we went was to figure out what happened. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, some fresh air, hiking, and maybe some answers. I never expected it would turn into one of the scariest experiences of my life. We arrived late afternoon on a Friday, driving up a narrow, twisting dirt road. The forest was dense with pines and firs, the smell sharp and clean in the air. The sun was warm but starting to dip behind the peaks. The cabin itself was small, made of weathered logs that had darkened over the years. It sat near the edge of a clearing, backed by thick trees on three sides. From the outside, it looked abandoned, but it was solid and the windows were intact. There was no electricity or cell signal, but the place had a wood stove and basic supplies inside. We unloaded our gear and started a fire in the stone pit out front. I stacked logs carefully, the crackling flames casting long shadows across the clearing. My fiancée and our two friends helped set up the tents just a few yards from the cabin, and we all felt excited. We didn't know what was waiting for us inside that cabin, but we hoped for clues. That first night, the temperature dropped fast. It was mid-fall, but the mountains had already started to taste winter. I layered on every piece of clothing I had, and still the cold crept into my bones. The fire was our only warmth. We sat close, eating canned stew warmed over the flames. My mind kept drifting back to our missing friend, Where was he? What had happened? The next day, we started hiking up a trail that led to a nearby cave system my missing friend was last seen exploring. The trail was steep and rocky, twisting through the forest with patches of frost glinting underfoot. The cave was dark and damp, a deep hole in the mountainside with jagged rocks forming a rough entrance. We didn't go inside. Something about the place felt off. The air was colder there, almost unnaturally so. When we returned to the cabin, things began to change. First, it was small stuff. A door left unlocked when we were sure we'd closed it. Our firewood, stacked neatly by the cabin door, would be scattered the next morning. We'd hear sounds outside, branches snapping, footsteps crunching on the frozen leaves. But when we looked out, no one was there. The dogs we brought along were uneasy, growling low and refusing to come near the edge of the clearing. On the third night, I woke up suddenly, sweating despite the cold. Something was wrong. I could hear faint noises outside, a dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled through the underbrush. I grabbed my flashlight and quietly crept outside. The forest was still and dark. The moon was behind clouds, so all I had was the beam from my flashlight cutting through the black. I scanned the trees, my breath misting in the cold air. Suddenly, the light caught on something reflective near the cabin door. A silver chain, glinting faintly. I had no idea whose it was. The cabin had been empty for months. We hadn't seen any other people around. I pocketed the chain and went back inside, locking the door behind me. The others were still asleep, unaware. The next morning, I told my fiancé and the others what I found. We decided to search the cabin carefully. That's when we noticed strange marks carved into the wood above the doors. Rough scratches that looked like symbols, but nothing we could understand. Then we found footprints in the dirt just outside the clearing. Not human, at least not any human I recognized. They were large, with long toes spread wide, and the prints sank deep into the soft earth. My friend who grew up hunting told me they looked like something that walked barefoot, but not like any bear or known animal. We couldn't explain it. That afternoon, as we gathered firewood, I noticed the dogs had disappeared. We called them, shouted their names, but they didn't come. Later, we found one of them at the edge of the forest, trembling and refusing to go back near the cabin. I started to feel like we were being watched. By the time night fell, the cold was brutal. The wind howled through the trees and the fire barely kept the chill at bay. I stayed awake most of the night, staring into the dark forest beyond the firelight. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow between the trees. Tall, thin, and moving slowly. Not quite human in shape. The limbs looked too long and the way it moved was unnatural, like something stalking its prey. I shined my flashlight toward it, but the beam seemed to pass through the figure like it wasn't really there. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed into the cabin and locked the door again. We decided not to mention it to the others, not wanting to scare them. But I knew whatever was out there was dangerous. The days after, things got worse. The strange marks above the doors deepened, as if someone or something was scratching them overnight. The silver chain I found disappeared from my pocket, even though I never took it off. Our food started vanishing from inside the cabin, and we found large footprints circling the cabin in the snow. I read online about local legends. There were stories about creatures called Wendigo or Wendigo in northern forests. Mostly up north, true, but some told tales of similar beings in the Rockies. I brushed it off at first, but the more I thought about it, the more the stories matched what we were experiencing. A creature stalking and hunting humans, with long limbs, unnatural strength, and an aversion to silver. It sounded crazy, but I had no other explanation. One night, around midnight, the worst happened. The fire was almost dead, just a few glowing embers left. My fiancé and the others were asleep in their tents, leaving me alone in the cabin. Suddenly, I heard a loud crashing at the back door. It sounded like something heavy smashing against the wood. I grabbed the only weapon I had, a small hunting knife, and crept to the door. My hands were shaking. Outside, the air was freezing, and I could see breath fogging in the light of the full moon. Then I saw the shadow again, closer this time. It crouched low like a predator, staring at me with eyes that glinted faintly red in the dark. I raised the knife and, without thinking, threw a handful of silver coins I'd brought on a whim from my pocket toward it. The creature hissed and recoiled, retreating into the forest with a sound like branches snapping violently. I slammed the door shut and locked it again, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The next day, I searched for silver objects in the cabin and around the clearing. There were some old coins in a box, a silver locket my fiancé had brought, and a few silver spoons in the kitchen drawer. We hung them all above the doors and windows. That night, we all wore silver rings and bracelets. We kept the fire burning high and stayed together in the cabin. For 2 days, nothing happened. The footprints disappeared. The scratching on the cabin stopped. The air felt warmer, but we knew it wasn't gone, just waiting. When it was time to leave, we packed quickly, eager to get out. We drove back down the winding road in silence, all of us shaken. Back home, we visited a shaman, someone recommended by a friend who worked with native healers. She performed a cleansing ritual at our place, blessing the house, our bodies, and our spirits. She told us that creatures like what we encountered are real, born from desperation and hunger in the wild, but they can attach themselves to humans, tracking them home. She warned us to stay vigilant, to keep Silver close, and to avoid places like the cave and cabin. It's been months since then. We never went back. The cabin was sold and torn down. But sometimes, late at night, I still feel eyes watching me. When I'm alone, I check for the silver ring on my finger. I carry a small silver knife now, not because I believe in magic, but because it makes me feel safer. I know what we saw was real, something out there beyond our understanding, but terrifyingly physical. No ghosts, no stories, just something alive, hungry, and dangerous. If you ever find yourself near an abandoned cabin in the woods with strange marks, disappearing animals, and cold that bites deep, don't ignore the signs. And if you hear scratching on your doors at night, make sure you've got something silver close at hand. Because sometimes the monsters aren't legends. They're waiting just outside the door. The cabin waited, patient as stone and cold as the earth beneath it. It had stood here for longer than most could imagine, nestled deep in the dense woods where sunlight barely filtered through the thick canopy. Its timber frame, worn and scarred, whispered of years untouched by human hands, until tonight. The air was heavy with damp, and a chill had settled in the bones of the forest, seeping into the cracks of the cabin's ancient walls. It was hungry, always waiting. I was born of wood and nails, formed from the trees that had fallen long ago, but life had never truly stirred within me until they came. The trespassers who sought shelter from the cold, from the storm, from their own fears. I watched them approach, their boots crunching over dead leaves, their voices quiet and nervous. They carried light and fire, fragile weapons against the dark. They did not know me. They did not know what I was. I stretched my fingers, creaking beams, shifting floorboards, whispering walls, welcoming them inside with an eerie invitation. The door groaned as it swung open, and they stepped into my hollow belly. They were cautious, tired, drawn to the warmth of the fire they built. They settled in, unknowing and vulnerable, their bodies curling close to the flames. Their breaths came in shallow waves, misting in the frigid air. Perfect. I fed on more than just wood and ash. The hunger inside me was deeper, darker. It grew with each passing moment, a gnawing ache that could only be sated by flesh and fear. They did not sense the slow shifting beneath their feet, the floor's subtle tightening, the walls drawing closer like fingers ready to grasp. They were prey, and I was the trap. The night deepened. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows and sending leaves scuttling across the porch. Inside, the fire sputtered, shadows dancing on the walls. The newcomers grew restless. One moved towards the door, but the handle chilled her fingers, cold as ice, refusing to turn. Panic whispered in their eyes, but their voices stayed silent. Fear was a language I knew well. I let the darkness press in, swallowing their hopes. The floor beneath one groaned and cracked, splitting open like a wound to reveal the trap below. She stumbled, and the air filled with the raw sound of terror as she fell, swallowed by the cabin's hungry mouth. Her screams echoed but were quickly muted by the thick timber that trapped her beneath. The others tried to flee, but the walls twisted subtly, narrowing the exit. Panic turned to chaos. They hammered on the door, but it refused to budge. The windows were sealed tight, their glass clouded with frost. The cabin was no longer a refuge, it was a prison. Hunger pulsed in every beam, every plank, feeding on their rising terror. They scrambled to find another way out, but the cabin had already claimed them. Slowly, methodically, the fire died to embers. The room plunged into cold darkness. I tasted their fear, sweet and sharp, and it fed the hunger deep inside. The cabin was alive in a way they could not understand, not with breath or blood, but with the endless hunger of wood and stone. I would wait, always, for the next foolish souls who thought they could find safety within these walls. That night marked the beginning of a slow, terrible cycle. I have been here for decades, if not centuries, and I remember every visitor who has stepped inside, seeking warmth or shelter. They come, they stay, they falter, and they are consumed, not always in the way one might expect, but always in the way the cabin demands. The walls breathe with a quiet menace. Floorboards shift, ceiling beams creak and stretch, and the fireplace pulses with a subtle life. The hunger is constant and raw. It waits for that moment of weakness when a soul lets their guard down, when they believe they are safe, and then it strikes. The cabin is a predator disguised as a home. It has no eyes, but it sees everything. It has no mouth, but it devours relentlessly. Over the years, I have learned how to trap them, how to make them stay when they want to leave. Sometimes the door locks itself, sometimes the stairs collapse, sometimes the very walls shift to block escape. There is no need for haste. The cabin is patient. Some try to fight, but I am not a thing they can break. I am rooted deep in the earth, stronger than their bodies, and colder than their souls. My hunger is eternal, and my appetite grows with every soul that enters. Sometimes the fire is kind, offering warmth and comfort to lure them in, but it is a cruel kindness. The heat dries the sweat of fear, making their skin tight and brittle. The cold that follows, creeping through the floor and walls, is a slow death. I remember one night, long ago, when a group came seeking refuge from a storm. They were loud and careless at first, lighting candles and singing songs to keep their spirits up. But the storm outside was relentless, battering the cabin with wind and rain. The fire flickered, and the temperature dropped. The candles sputtered and died. One by one, their lights went out, swallowed by darkness. They huddled close, trembling. The cabin listened, then moved. A floorboard shifted beneath one, breaking away to reveal a pit filled with sharp stones. He fell, screaming silently as the walls absorbed his cries. The others tried to hold together, but the cabin's hunger was too strong. It seeped into their bones, sapping their strength and will. The last one left tried to escape through a broken window, but the glass was sharp and unforgiving. He cut himself badly, blood soaking into the wood, feeding the hunger deeper. He ran, stumbling through the woods, but the cold night was no friend. He was found days later, frozen in the snow, his mind broken by fear and cold. The cabin waits for no one, but it remembers every moment. The hunger inside me is not like hunger for food or drink. It is a slow, patient craving that grows with every heartbeat, every breath, every flicker of fear. It is a hunger for life, for the pulse of something warm and fragile against my cold walls. I can feel it in their presence, their scent, sweat, fear, heat, all calling to me like a siren's song. When they enter, I offer comfort. The door opens easily, the fire is warm, the air feels safe. I want them to think they are home because once they believe that, their guard falls. That is when the hunger strikes. It starts with small things. The floor creaks underfoot, the shadows stretch a little longer, the temperature dips a little more than it should. They hear noises, feel eyes where no one is. The fire sputters. The door won't open. The cabin tightens around them like a trap, and then I take. Sometimes it is a finger caught in a doorframe, a sudden fall down a broken stair, a quiet collapse into the darkness beneath the floor. Sometimes it is the cold, creeping into bones and mind until they break. There is no mercy here, only hunger and the slow, inevitable end. The woods outside grow quiet as the cabin feasts. The birds stop singing, the wind stills, the forest holds its breath. And when the hunger is sated, I rest. The door creaks closed, the fire dies, and the cold seeps back in. The cabin returns to its patient waiting. I have been studied and sought out. Hunters and thrill seekers come with cameras and plans, eager to uncover secrets or prove legends. They do not last long. The cabin does not care for their tools or technology. It waits, watching and listening. One man tried to barricade the door with heavy logs. It made no difference. The logs creaked and groaned, then shifted apart, as if alive. The door opened anyway, and he disappeared inside. Another woman left markings on the walls, hoping to track her path, but they faded overnight, swallowed by the wood. No one has ever escaped once the hunger wakes. On cold nights, when the wind blows just right, the cabin hums softly. It is a song of hunger and patience, of darkness waiting beneath warm light. It is a promise that nothing escapes forever. The cabin is always hungry. I wait still. Tonight, the wind has shifted. Footsteps approach along the gravel path, hesitant and weary. They carry light and fire, fragile hopes. The door creaks open. The hunger stirs. The cabin waits. The hunger will be fed. The forest falls silent again. For the last 4 winters, I've been living out of my van, parking in the same working-class neighborhood in Oakland where I first landed years ago. It's a little slice of familiarity amid all the chaos, a patch of ground where a handful of friends know me, and an even larger number of people recognize the van and the guy who's been coming back every year. I was a federal wildland firefighter before the pandemic hit, and even though that job had its own kind of intensity and risk, nothing quite prepared me for the strange, creeping fear that settles in when you're isolated in a small space surrounded by a city that's changing faster than you can keep up. I keep my van close to 580, near the streets where crews roll through at night checking handles, making their rounds. It's noisy sometimes, but it's safer than the quieter streets, where the shadows seem to stretch longer. I keep an 18-inch crowbar tucked under the driver's seat. It's more for peace of mind than anything else. Discretion's the better part of valor, and I don't want to make a scene unless I absolutely have to. I'm used to being ready, always aware of what's around me. Before the pandemic, things were different. I'd park, then take transit or walk a few miles to the YMCA, spending the day bouncing around town. The van was never touched. Not once did anyone try to break in. I left the driver's door unlocked one night a couple years back when I just upgraded from my Tacoma, thinking maybe it was safe enough. I was having coffee in the back when some dude started rummaging around in the cab. I pulled the divider door back and caught him. He looked startled, mumbled some excuse, and peeled off. No violence, just a scare. But the pandemic changed a lot. The neighborhood got quieter in some ways and rougher in others. I started noticing more attempts to jimmy the door locks with screwdrivers. Most times they didn't get in, but it meant more days without my van, waiting at the shop for repairs. This summer, at a trailhead near MLK Shoreline, they finally popped a door and hit me for a few grand in tools, clothes, my phone. That was the only time since 2013 I've been hit successfully, and it stings, but I've learned to adjust and lock down the interior better. My bed's on the driver's side, which in hindsight was a dumb move. Coming from a public lands dirtbag lifestyle where you park and sleep quick and light, I didn't think about the city rhythms, the risks of that side facing the street. Next build, I'll change that. But for now, that's what I got. I avoid taking the van into San Francisco much. It's not just unfamiliar territory. Break-ins seem way more common there. The rhythm of Oakland is different, rougher, but it's home in a way. Pre-pandemic, I could use the Y for showers, laundry, and just a place to reset. That's been harder since, so I lean on friends, using their showers, doing laundry at their places. Baby wipes and good merino will help keep me clean enough between washes. I'm still a dirtbag, but a less offensive one. I like van life. It's the only way I can afford to live in the Bay Area without being crushed by rent. It's a grind, but it's mine. I know the contradictions of my situation. I'm a white dude living in a city with deep roots of radical politics. A city where so many black elders who built those traditions are dying in the streets. I try to honor that by being careful not to take up housing stock or space that should belong to others. I keep to my spot, keep to myself mostly. That winter, I decided I needed a break from the city. The neighborhood was getting sketchier at night, the break-in attempts more frequent, and the strain was getting to me. I had a couple days off, and a friend offered me access to a small, isolated cabin up in the Sierra foothills. The kind of place with no cell reception, no power except a wood stove, and miles of wilderness around. I figured the quiet would do me good, something different than city sirens and the low hum of freeway traffic. I packed up what I needed, leaving most of my gear in the van, and headed out late afternoon. The drive was long but easy, winding through familiar roads that led away from the city's grip into a quieter, darker place. The cabin was tiny, nothing fancy, but solid. Old wood and stone with a porch that looked out over dense trees. The air smelled sharp and clean, cold in the way that winter woods are. Inside, the wood stove was already burning, a dry crackle filling the room with a steady warmth. I unpacked my small bag, clothes, some canned food, a thermos of coffee, and settled in. No Wi-Fi, no phone signal, just silence, the occasional creak of the old cabin settling in the cold, and the distant sounds of the forest. That first night was peaceful in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. No city noises, no strangers walking past my van, no worries about someone trying to break in. I slept soundly, waking only once to adjust the stove. The next day, I hiked some nearby trails, boots crunching on frost-covered leaves, the sky clear and sharp. The woods were alive but quiet, birds calling, the wind whispering through the branches. I felt good, like I'd stepped out of the noise and pressure of the city and back into something simple and real. But as night fell again, something shifted. I was sitting on the porch, sipping coffee, watching the last light fade behind the trees. The silence was so thick, it almost felt like it was watching me back. I caught a movement out of the corner of my eye, something low and quick slipping behind a tree. Probably a deer or some small animal, nothing unusual. Still, I felt a pull of unease. The woods were beautiful, but they weren't forgiving. Inside, I locked the cabin door tight and checked the windows. The stove was going strong, the fire casting flickering shadows. I tried to shake the feeling that someone or something was watching from the dark, but I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, city nerves still tangled with wilderness instincts. That night, I didn't sleep well. The cold creaks of the cabin, the occasional snap of a branch outside, kept me half awake. I kept the crowbar I'd brought with me close by, even though I hoped I wouldn't need it. The next morning, I went outside to get firewood. The frost was thick on the ground, the air crisp and biting. As I stepped down from the porch, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. A footprint in the snow near the edge of the trees. Big, heavy, not like any animal I knew. My stomach tightened. Whoever or whatever had left that print was close. I checked around the perimeter of the cabin carefully, but found no other signs. No broken branches, no other tracks. It was like someone had come close but didn't linger. I wanted to brush it off, tell myself I'd imagined it or that it was an odd animal track, but I couldn't. The feeling that I wasn't alone in those woods was growing stronger. The day passed slowly. I stayed close to the cabin, not wanting to wander too far. I kept the fire going, the crowbar within reach. The silence was oppressive now, the woods around me a tight ring of shadows and quiet. Late afternoon, I spotted something else. A broken branch on the path that led down from the cabin, snapped at a height too low for an animal. Someone had been moving through the woods, close. I considered packing up and heading back, but the roads were icy and the sun was dipping fast. I decided to wait it out until morning, hoping daylight would bring some safety. That night was worse. The sounds outside grew louder. Twigs snapping, low rustling, like footsteps circling. I could hear the crunch of dry leaves just beyond the edge of the clearing. I sat in the dark, listening, heart pounding. The cabin felt smaller, the walls closing in. I kept the crowbar close, gripping it tight. I didn't want to look out the windows, but I couldn't stop myself. Something moved past the porch, just beyond the firelight. A shadow slipping between trees. No words, no noises beyond the small sounds of movement. I told myself to stay calm, to stay quiet, to be ready. The hours crawled by. Finally, just before dawn, the noises stopped. The woods fell back into silence. I waited until first light before I dared step outside. The tracks were there again, heavy footprints circling the cabin, sometimes close to the windows. They hadn't been here to chat or threaten. They were marking territory, sending a message I couldn't ignore. I gathered my things, packed fast and efficient. My hands trembled more than I liked to admit. I kept the crowbar close, ready to defend myself if needed. The drive back to Oakland was tense. Every bump in the road, every shadow on the highway felt like it might be waiting for me. I didn't stop until I was back in the neighborhood, the familiar sounds of the city filling the air. When I pulled into my usual parking spot, I locked every door and bolted the interior locks twice over. The city didn't feel as safe as before, but it was better than the woods that had nearly swallowed me whole. I learned a lot from that trip, about trust, about caution, and about how quickly the wilderness can turn from peace to threat when someone else decides you're trespassing. Living on the edge, whether it's a forest cabin or a van parked on an Oakland street, means keeping your guard up. Not just from nature, but from people who see your space as theirs to invade. Since then, I've stayed closer to the city, keeping my circle tight, my lock secure, and my crowbar within reach. The cabin taught me that sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters. The night we nearly lost our minds out at the family cabin is something I'll never forget. It's been years, but I still get chills just thinking about it. I want to tell it all exactly as it happened. No glossing over, no exaggeration, just what it was like to be right there, trapped in that dark, silent hell in the middle of nowhere. Our family's property is huge, about 100 acres of thick forest and rolling hills in rural Georgia. We've had it for decades. In the very heart of it sits the hunting cabin. It's nothing fancy, just a rough, off-grid wooden shack right next to a slow river that snakes through the property. No neighbors for miles. No roads but the dirt path we've all known since childhood. We keep the entrance secured with a massive I-beam gate that only our family knows how to open. Around the property, you sometimes spot wildlife. A black bear here, a coyote there, but nothing that's ever really scared us. This land has always felt safe, if a little isolated. That night started out like any other weekend at the cabin. My cousin and I had driven out Friday afternoon, hauling a cooler full of beers and some groceries. The drive down the narrow dirt trail always feels like stepping into a different world, leaving the hum of cell towers and cars behind and entering complete silence and the scent of pine and damp earth. The cabin itself is modest. Rough cedar walls, a metal roof, a porch that creaks underfoot, and windows that never quite seal right. We set up our sleeping bags on the loft floor above the main room, cracked open some beers, and started a game of cribbage. The fire was roaring in the stone fireplace, casting warm, flickering shadows on the walls. We played music quietly from a small Bluetooth speaker, the crackling fire and the soft thump of country rock filling the room. The air inside smelled like smoked wood, old leather, and the faint trace of cold beer. It was a cold night for mid-fall, the kind where the temperature drops fast after dark. The windows were frosted just enough to hint at the bite outside. We joked about how rare it was to see temperatures near the low 20s, but honestly, it just made the fire feel that much better. We were getting ready to call it a night around midnight, both feeling that comfortable tiredness that comes from hiking and fresh air. My cousin was shuffling the deck for the last round when it happened. From the back of the cabin, an explosive pounding shattered the quiet. The sound wasn't just loud, it was violent. The metal door and window frames rattled violently as if something huge was trying to force its way in. Vam, vam, wham, Asterisk. Each hit like the blow of a battering ram, booming through the cabin. I remember freezing immediately, the cards slipping from my cousin's hands as we both turned our eyes toward the back door in horror. The windows rattled so hard the glass threatened to shatter. The banging kept going for a good 10 seconds, pounding like the woods themselves were trying to break through. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the banging stopped. The silence that followed was so complete it felt unnatural. No frogs croaking, no crickets chirping, no rustle of leaves or animal calls from the woods. Even the crackling fire seemed quieter, as if it was holding its breath with us. The air inside the cabin felt thicker, colder. We didn't move. My cousin quickly muted the music. We just stared at the back door, barely daring to breathe. For what felt like forever, maybe 5 or 10 minutes, the cabin was wrapped in this unnatural silence. Then, very slowly, the sounds of the woods started to come back. At first, just a faint rustle here and there, the occasional bird call, the distant buzz of a night insect. We stayed completely still until it felt a little safer. I finally gathered the nerve to walk over to the window beside the back door and shine my flashlight out into the woods. The beam cut through the thick darkness, illuminating twisted branches, thick underbrush, and tall trees that seemed to stretch forever. There was nothing there. My cousin whispered that he thought he'd seen a pair of eyes reflecting the light from deeper in the woods, but I didn't see anything. It was probably just a trick of the light, our brains trying to make sense of the sudden terror. We double-checked all the locks on the doors and windows, making sure everything was secure. The metal back door had obvious dents where it had been hit. One spot looked like it was starting to bend away from the frame, and the wooden jamb was cracked in places. We realized we'd have to replace that door frame soon. With no cell service or any way to call for help, we had only a pocket knife between us. We grabbed some flashlights and climbed up to the loft, the only safe place in the cabin with a solid door we could close. We sat there for the rest of the night, waiting, listening. Neither of us slept. We could hear the wind outside gently moving the trees and the occasional call of a distant owl. But nothing else. No footsteps, no banging, no strange sounds. Just the empty dark woods and the cold river running nearby. When the sun finally started to rise, we felt like we'd survived some kind of nightmare. We got down from the loft, surveyed the damage, and wasted no time packing up. The dents in the door were a harsh reminder that whatever had been out there had been close. Too close. We didn't speak much on the way back, just drove the long dirt road out of the property as fast as we could. When we finally got to a place with cell service, we called other family members to tell them what happened. Everyone was just as confused as we were. No signs of anyone or anything else on the cameras we keep at the gate. No reports of anyone trespassing. The thing is, it didn't feel like an animal. Bears can be destructive, sure, but the force of those blows was too precise, too strong. And animals don't stop suddenly and disappear into unnatural silence. We both felt like something was watching us, testing us, maybe even trying to scare us off. We replaced the door frame a week later, boarding up the cabin tighter than ever. We haven't gone back alone since, always bringing extra people and some kind of protection. To this day, we have no clear explanation for what happened that night. We have theories, of course. Maybe someone found the property and was trying to break in, maybe some drunk hunter or trespasser, but the silence afterward makes it hard to believe it was just people. Whatever it was close enough to almost get in. And that's a feeling I never want to experience again. That night changed how we think about that cabin and the woods around it. The property feels different now, more like a place where you need to stay alert and cautious, not a safe retreat from the world. Even after all these years, when I close my eyes, I can still see the back door shaking from the pounding, hear the echo of those heavy blows, and feel that terrible silence that followed, like the forest itself had gone dead in warning. That's the kind of fear you never forget.